seminar series on technology and development. For people who are coming here for the first time, my name is Pankaj Seksaria. I teach at Sitara, and as you probably know, we've been doing this series every semester where we have a very interesting set of people and scholars and researchers and practitioners come and speak on a range of topics, and perhaps you would have seen, you've attended some already. So welcome to this series. Today, I'm very glad to introduce Dr. Aswati Ravindran, who currently teaches at the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, KIFR in Mumbai. Her area of research is in the field of science and technology and science education with a focus in the field of biological sciences. She's also the member of the recently formed Science and Technology Studies Network, India Network, which some of us are members of. We've also started a small city chapter with early career researchers, postdocs and doctoral students. And we just had a little meeting before Aswati came with some of the students from IIT and from KIFR who came. So there's a new network that's been formed, an informal network of scholars interested in STS. So we are presenting, so this talk today is actually collaboration between Sitara and this network that are actually been formed. And Aswati coordinates, or is going to coordinate, it has not yet been created, coordinates the feminist STS subgroup that looks at the interconnections of gender, science and technology. And I think it might sound esoteric a little bit, but I think it's deeply relevant and important and embedded in science and technology, and something that we don't engage with or understand enough, the gender nature of science and technology. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we're very glad and looking forward very much to it. Thank you.
So the title of my talk is
you might be coming to way of that screen. We have a slide change.
Should I put this?
So we have a remote slide change. It is ready. We have.
This feels more intuitive using the laptop keys, but I'll try. So this would go okay.
You can also look at that screen.
Okay.
But you're still in the way.
Oh. Okay. So I look at this screen. Probably not bad. Talk about technology blocks.
Sorry, would you be comfortable in the middle of the? No.
Yeah, no, I think I'll be good. So what I'm going to be talking about is the gender nature of science and technology. It sounds very grand. But what I'll be doing is basically a very introductory talk. And the way I understand the scholarship and the literature around gender, science and technology in terms of, how I processed it while I was teaching. So my trajectory is basically in the natural sciences. I started off as a bachelor's student in biochemistry, and then went on to doing a master's in biotechnology. And then after that I did a PhD in science education, after which I worked at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in WITS, where I taught courses on science and technology studies as well as gender science and technology. Now I am back at the Homi Bhabha Center. My area of work is broadly in the field of science, technology and society education, as Pankaj was pointing out. And part of my research also sort of drew on the feminist critiques of science, because I was looking at how students make sense of topics such as reproductive technology, which are topics in the biology curriculum. And I was looking at the kind of ethical and the kind of political questions that they bring into their discussion of these technologies, and trying to sort of map the discourse and talk about what science education is missing. And part of that work I am carrying on. I have a strong interest in gender and science and technology, and trying to bring those questions into science education research. But for the purpose of this talk, I'll it will be very basic and it will be very introductory. I'll begin with some basic definitions, assuming that many people are not exposed to the discourse. In case people have been engaging with the scholarship and can bring in more nuance, I welcome you to also contribute to the conversation. So I'll begin with gender in science and technology and how do we understand it, and then focus on the question of gender representation in science and technology with a focus on the limitations of the dominant academic scholarship in this area. So this will be the broad scope of my talk, and I hope it will become clearer as I move forward. I hope I am not blocking the So we'll begin with how do we understand the term gender. I hope to make this a little interactive because I'm also not sure where people are in terms of thinking about gender. So can I get some responses on the question of how do we understand the term gender? What does the term gender mean to us? I know it's a very broad question, but nice to get some responses.
Anyone, come on, please.
Conforming to something, femininity, masculinity. We talk about in class as a scale, talking on one more.
Femininity, masculinity, yes. What are they? Transgender, okay.
The idea of biology and biology.
Biology, sex and gender, yes. Anything else that comes up?
Social construct, conforming to it.
So it's a social construct, okay. Questions of conforming, not conforming. Anything else?
Striving to a label.
A label. Any other responses?
Identity.
Identity, yes. So, quite a few responses. So, as he points out, gender is a very central aspect of our identity. People identify as belonging to various genders and they use diverse kinds of terminology to self-identify, and of course you've heard of all these terms: cis women, cis men, trans men, hijra, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and so on. Right? So we use a range of terminology to talk about our gender identity. We are also, however, socialized by a gender-normative society to become men and women, expressing exclusively masculine and feminine traits. And very often this is culturally shaped and culturally conditioned. And of course, as some of you pointed out, there's also a related category, which is sex. What we are biologically in terms of the kind of sexual organs that we have or the sort of genitalia that we have, and of course the sexual characteristics. And very often we are made to believe that there is a sort of a correspondence between the sex that we are assigned to and a particular gender, right? So very often, so if we are born into the body of a female, we are socialized by gender normative society to become women. But as we know, this is not always the case. It's not necessary that the sex that we are born into would necessarily make us a particular gender or make us identify with a particular gender. The other aspect that I want to point out is that gender identity is also intersectional. You might have heard this term. Of course, it would require, we would require an entire course to unpack all this, but I'm just sort of, introducing you to some basic terminology. So, we simultaneously experience gender with other social categories such as caste, class, ability, race, and so on. So, for instance, as an upper caste middle class woman, I experience my femininity or I express my gender in a specific way, and it would be very different from someone who is a lower caste working class woman. How she expresses her femininity or how she experiences her gender would be very different. Right? So gender also needs to be understood as an intersectional category along with other social categories such as caste, class, ability, race, and so on. The next term that I want to talk about is patriarchy, because these are also conceptual categories with which we will look at science as a social institution. How do you understand the term patriarchy? What does patriarchy mean to you? What is patriarchy? How do you understand?
Very dominated society.
Okay, yes. Any other?
Systemic.
It's a systemic, a structural aspect.
Rigid or
Yes.
strange.
Yes. Okay. So, very simple, as he's pointing out, it's a social order that hierarchizes gender. And I just like to sort of present this definition of patriarchy that was proposed by V. Geeta in her book Patriarchy, which is a part of the Theorizing Feminism series. It's a very good introductory book, and I'd recommend this to all of you. So patriarchy rests on defined notions of masculine and feminine, as you were pointing out, is held in place by sexual and property arrangements that privilege men's choices, desires and interests over and above those of the women and other genders in their lives, and is sustained by social relationships and cultural practices which celebrate heterosexuality, female fertility and motherhood on the one hand, and valorize female subordination to masculine authority and virility on the other. Of course, this is a long definition, but just sort of process it quickly, and I'm sure it will make more sense as we move forward and we talk about the patriarchal culture of sciences and technology. So what is gendered about science and technology? Is there anything particularly gendered about science and technology? What are your immediate responses to this question? I can stand here and pontificate about it, but as I'm assuming that many of you are students of science and technology, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to ask you what your backgrounds are, but I'm assuming that. But what does it mean to you when someone says that science and technology is gender? Do you understand?
Representation, gender representation in the academic scholarship.
Okay.
And another is obviously the knowledge production, how whether there are inherent gender bias driving the knowledge production processes.
Okay. So one, of course, that's the way I think feminist scholarship would also characterize it in terms of the question of representation and also on the question of knowledge construction, right? So there are these two aspects. Yes.
I mean, the question whether women and men do science and technology differently.
Yes.
That's a question I always have and keep getting asked.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be a question I also have about.
Yes. So that's again connected to the question of knowledge, whether knowledge construction itself is gendered, and whether women and men, would they do science differently? Would a woman do a more feminine science or construct a more feminine technology? So there are these questions as well.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Is there something like feminine science in the science? And science
We can repeat the question so that it
Yes.
again.
So she's asking, is there something called a feminine science or a masculine science? She says that science is science. So how would people respond to this?
Yes, I can understand that gender can maybe bring in preferences in terms of the problems that people choose to work on. Maybe even the way they approach problems. But if we say science in the most abstract sense of science,
Okay.
right? I mean thermodynamics, right? The laws of gravity. Is there a gendered aspect to this?
That's a very important question, and that is also something that the feminist scholarship is grappling with. The gendered nature of science, and especially whether there is essentially something gendered about knowledge construction, is something that has been explored extensively in the biological sciences, not so much in the physical and the engineering sciences. But however, there are specific resources that I can direct you to think about this question in relation to physics and engineering. We'll come to that later on. So any other, yeah, so I think broadly people talked about the question of representation, and people also talked about the question of whether knowledge itself is gendered, right? So I would sort of break this question down into into a series of questions that we can try to answer at a very simple level, and which would help you to think through this question, right? So one way of asking this question very simply, right, like, I mean, probably less academically, is who's considered to be good or able at science and technology? Are there specific cultural perceptions of who's good in science or who's good in technology? Would you say yes? Okay.
This is the whole debate about STEM and push more women because they're not enough. The whole idea that engineers are representatively men.
Yes, engineering itself is considered to be a masculine field, and when we look at the question of numbers, we will see that. Some other questions are, who gets to do science and technology? Is there something specific to the social location of some people, of such people, right? So is there a particular profession who's good at science and technology? Another question is there something specific to the social location of such people? And of course, this is something we'll also see in terms of the numbers. Another way of asking this question is, who gets to benefit from science and technology? Is there a particular group of people who gets to benefit more from science and technology? You say that's the case. Any thoughts on this?
I would ask benefit in what terms? Benefit in terms of recognition? Are you getting your research? All about finding what the benefit you are saying.
So okay, benefit for the person who's doing it. Do they get recognition? I'm also thinking more in terms of who are these scientific and technological applications directed towards? Who gets to enjoy the benefits of it? Is there a specific demographic that benefits from it? Right? So there are questions of this kind. Who is harmed by science and technology? This is another way of asking. Right? And of course, the final question, as she puts it, is there anything social? As you were also pointing out, is there anything social or gender about scientific and technological knowledge in itself? So these are various ways to think about this question. And as practitioners, it might help to constantly revisit these questions, and especially when you are designing the technology or doing science. Now we'll look at the question of representation, and that's what I'll be focusing on primarily in this talk. So one thing that I want to point out is studies on gender and representation in sciences have largely been limited to studies of representation of cis women vis-a-vis cis men. And you see a range of such kinds of empirical studies on gender, starting from the 1990s with people like Maitreyi Krishnaraj. Then of course you have a lot of studies also mushrooming in the 2000s, Jayashree Subramanian, Meena Gopal and Veena Punacha, Anita Kurup, and so on, who have looked at the question of representation, who have looked at the question of experiences of cis women in the sciences. If you look at the participation of women in the sciences, at least according to a recent study by Anita Kurup, or this is what she mentions, has risen dramatically in the last few decades, especially in the post-70s. Now a few quick a brief sort of a very sketchy and brief history of women's education, higher education in India, and this is primarily from Abha Sood's work. It is in the 1880s that you see women starting to graduate from universities. And this happened with the introduction of English education by the colonial administration. At that point of time, education for women was seen as necessary to eliminate social evils, right? Like sati, polygamy, and so on and so forth. But also necessary for them to discharge their functions as bearers of culture and tradition. So the understanding is that women also need an education so that they can be efficient mothers and wives, and because they are also bringing up a future generation. But in spite of all this, you also see women slowly accessing higher education, especially in the first few decades of the 20th century. And primarily these were upper class women, and very often the families were kind of benignly indifferent to them accessing education. By this she means, at least this is what Abha Sood says, what she means is that a lot of these families were not really concerned about women accessing employment after getting a higher education. And they were also not concerned particularly about the accessing education and women's subsequent participation in civic life. So, but however, you do see women entering higher education in the first few decades of the 20th century. It's in the early 20th century that you hear of women scientists, especially E.K. Janaki Ammal is someone whose name you may have heard of. She is a botanist and a cytogeneticist who worked on grasses and cereals. And there's a remarkable biography of hers by Savitri Preeta Nair, which is called Chromosome Woman Nomad Scientist. It is also a very interesting it also presents a very interesting social history of botanical sciences in the 20th century. Then of course you have a few women physicists, like for example Kamala Sohoni, you might have heard of her. She was one of the first physicists who joined C.V. Raman's lab. She had to fight to get a space there. Then you have Annamani, Sunandabai, Asima Chatterjee. Annamani and Sunandabai and Lalita Chandrasekhar and their stories, a collective biography, is something that Abha Sood has written about. One thing that Abha Sood points out is, especially when it comes to scientists, women scientists of early 20th century, was the incompatibility between marriage and a life in science. And this is something that you also see being articulated about women scientists of contemporary times. So this was a problem that existed back then, and it's also something that's constantly articulated, the question of representation even today. Bachelor of Arts, in which you see 52% female and 48% male. Bachelor of Science, again you see a very good representation of women, 52.3% and 47.3% male. Bachelor of Commerce, 48.5% female, 51.5% male. And Bachelor of Technology, as one of you pointed out, I think the lady there pointed out, it's the lowest in terms of female representation. So the question is, why this ratio in engineering? And why is there this skewed ratio in engineering, the way you understand it?
Because the thought is we are having a mechanical engineering and civil branches in engineering institutes. It is general understanding, and I have seen parents not preferring admitting their girls to these core branches because they think that they always want some software jobs, so more it leans towards CSE and IT.
Right.
And in India's academic institutes, if you see, CSE and IT has started coming in the later stages. So core branches are mechanical, electrical, and civil are their older engineering institutes. That might has impact.
But why do you think there's a gendering in this sense? Why do you think more women towards software and lesser women towards mechanical? What is the basis of it?
Might be because of like jobs being offered after graduating from these branches are more on the field. So it is general understanding that women are not capable to handle the jobs which are
Related to the field.
They are unable to go on shop floors. They are unable to handle the civil jobs, and they are unable to handle the workforce. So that is I have seen. And frankly, in a corporate also people don't like to work under female bosses. That is what my
Any other observations on this? Why is there a gendering? So if you can see, mechanical engineering has only 6%. Thank you for this. Safety is another concern. Because of the hazards associated with it. Yeah.
Starts with school enrollment in professional education. Because our society thinks that grade earning is men's job, right? Women are just, they should at least graduate. That's what. Okay. That's the basic thinking. That starts with that, and then it goes to women cannot handle manual labor or harsh working conditions. The body is not designed to that. This kind
Working
of
with tools.
yeah, working with tools. This layered thinking goes into this.
I think there is a general sense of conditioning that takes place in schools at a very young age also. Out of life experience, I can share that the teachers who prepared us for competitive exams also shared anecdotes which kind of conditioned the entire class to believe that there were certain departments of engineering which preferred having male students over female students, or even the environment that the department provided the environment that was provided was perhaps more conducive for the male students to work over there in the workshops over women. And this was done right when we were preparing for the competitive exam. It was done in school when we were extremely young. And I believe that had a lot of impact on the students. Even though it did not come from their personal experience, but just hearing those things conditioned students to have a general notion.
So in coaching institutes, your tutors would
Yes.
say this. So yes, many of you have given possible reasons as to why there is a skewed ratio, especially when you look at the various branches within engineering and the patriarchal assumptions that are underpin that, right? So if you look at the All India Survey of Higher Education 2020-2021, what you see is that women's enrollment in the sciences at the undergraduate level has increased and achieved parity with that of men, right? So this is the aggregated data for all disciplinary specializations from 2013 to 2021. So as you can see, this is the plot for female enrollment, and you see that it's touching the 50% mark, and in fact it's crossing the 50% mark. Now if you look at the trends in women's enrollment in STEM at the post-graduation level from 2013 to 2021, right? Like if you look at, so here you have data on sub-disciplines and the percentage enrollment of women at the postgraduate level. You see biosciences at the top, in fact almost touching 70%. Then you have mathematics here, which has a really big shape. After that you have chemistry, where you see kind of a steady increase. physics, all of which have sort of crossed the 50% mark in terms of representation at the PG level. And then you have engineering and technology, which remains kind of at below 40%. So one thing that you also notice here is that after 2020-2021 there's a slight dip, and probably that has to do with the. So overall you do see the specific trend and you do see the representation at a reasonable level, especially for a lot of the STEM subdisciplines except engineering and technology. Now if you look at the trends in women's enrollment in STEM at the PhD level from 2013 to 2021, this is again based on the aggregated data from All India Survey of Higher Education, compiled from all the reports. This is the 50% mark, and you only see biosciences above the 50% mark. But if you look at all the other disciplines, they are below 50%. However, you do see a slight increase in the enrollment for chemistry, physics, a slight increase in engineering and technology. Mathematics again is slightly dipping here. But yes, you do see that there is a flip in some sense. If you look at the post-graduation level and the enrollment, and then you look at the PhD level and the enrollment. So at the PhD level, representation remain under 50%. So what happens between post-graduation and PhD? How do you explain this? Pat comes to response. Yeah, and this is probably the gap that can be explained by family and marriage. Now, of course, you looked at the data, the All India Survey of Higher Education data. And this is not a great, this is comprehensive in the sense that it has surveyed a large number of universities, research institutions and so on. But there are also limitations to the data. Can you point out some of the limitations as you see it? Like as someone who's interested in this question, you see something that's missing.
This might be great for not only for women, because I see that the number of job availabilities in the country, those are exactly those, like if your job availabilities in the markets are more, people are not going towards the post-graduation PhD. That is what my observation is. Because our general social question is, if you are going to do the same job after doing PG and PhD, just enter at a UG level, so that you get increments in your job. So that is what so it may have happened that number of jobs available in the market are more, so that even not only women but even the male candidates have also joined after undergraduation the jobs. So the trend has gone down even for male.
So you can construct a particular hypothesis as to how this is related to job availability, right? But what I'm thinking of is that you see some obvious limitations in the data, right? Yeah.
Enrollments don't convert into something else.
Enrollments, yes. We cannot talk about, you mean attrition is not something that is very obvious, yeah. Yes. Anything else?
The data does not capture the intersectional level. It talks
Exactly.
about two broad categories,
Yeah.
but there are so many intersectional identities, and that might have might give a better picture of the environment scenario. And also it takes a very binary view of gender and does not talk about the entire spectrum of gender, the people who do not conform to the binary.
Absolutely, yes. Any other observations?
It does not give spatial picture. It does not give spatial picture, like in which institutes these men and women are enrolling. Kind of, are they enrolling at top institutes, especially top institutes like IITs and
Yes. Yeah.
So,
The segregation in terms of types of institutions is not something that you can see. So there are some lot of interesting research questions and hypotheses that you are all spontaneously coming up with, right? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. That's what it indicates. So as you said, assumes gender as binary. The intersectional aspect, no indication of the caste composition of the women who managed to enter PG or PhD in STEM disciplines, and that's one of you was pointing out, no sense of the attrition rate. We just know that these many people are enrolled, but we don't know how many are dropping off, right? But what we do see is, the gender gap. So what we were talking about is enrollment at the level of higher education. But what we do see is that the gender gap when women enter the workforce still remains, and just at a low level. However, I have been looking for data, I've been seeing references to various reports which are saying 23%, but I have not been able to track those reports. But I do feel that, I do get the sense that, the gender gap exists at the level of the workforce, also because of the AISHE 2021 data, which says that, the gender ratio when it comes to the teaching faculty between men and women, there is a difference. You have about 75 women to 100 male faculty, that's what it says is the gender gap. But what it also says is that for more precarious and temporary positions, only there you see a lot of teaching faculty. As you go higher up, from the assistant professor level to the associate professor level, the professor level, the number of women teaching faculty drastically decrease. So studies, of course, and there are extensive, as I already mentioned, there are a lot of studies that have shown the role of unfair hiring practices, discrimination in salaries, even in the recruitment of PhD students. There are biases because there's a worry that women will get married and will not complete their PhD. Of course, all of which you are aware of. And of course, disregard of women's authority, competence, and so on. So the gender perception of merit also exists in scientific institutions. The Jayashree Subramanian study, which is published in the Indian Journal of Gender Studies, gives a good account of how there are specific assumptions about the inherent merit or ability of women scientists vis-a-vis male scientists. And it's a 2007 study, and it interviews both women scientists and male scientists. And of course, just as it was the case for women scientists in the early 20th century, family remains a major obligation for women in science, and of course family obligations involve primarily care work. For example, in Kurup's study, the number of women who reported themselves as being never married in the women in research, the women who do as researchers, was only 14%, which indicates that majority of women still, they remain married and still continue to do a lot of arduous research. But that doesn't mean that they are not unproductive. In fact, in women in Kurup's study also reported working more than men, like in the sense more than 40, close to 60 hours of work than male scientists who just touched about 40 hours. This is a 2010 study. But there is a limitation in the sense that the women surveyed in most of these studies were cis upper caste women. And this also, of course, indicates the location of the researchers who have conducted these studies, who also primarily tend to be cis upper caste women. Experiences of women from various caste and minority groups and gender minority groups, which include transgender, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary persons, have only recently emerged in the past 1 decade. For example, there is a qualitative study by Kondaya Etan, which reports experiences of discrimination faced by Dalit women, the Dalit woman and Adivasi woman, and the trans man in science. This is an autobiographical narrative, and it talks about very extreme forms of violence that these people experienced in scientific institutions, especially sexual harassment, which is not reported in the studies that I earlier mentioned. Rennie Thomas, of course, is another person whose work is worth looking at, and he talks about documents the Brahminical culture of scientific institutions, and does a very interesting ethnographic study of the Indian Institute of Science, where he talks about Brahmanism and how, especially in, for example, segregation of dining halls, the specific kinds of cultural privileges that tend to be upheld in these spaces. There's another report that I'm going to talk about, which is a report by Sayantan Datta, which is titled "No Space for Some: Transgender, Gender Non-Conforming and Gender Non-Binary Persons' Access to Science Higher Education in India." And this is an important study, and it talks about and tries to document the experience of transgender, gender non-conforming and gender non-binary persons in Indian science. Tries to understand what are the kinds of social locations these people come from, the policy interventions as they suggest that would improve their experience in institutional spaces. And the methodology used in the study is to file RTIs with education institutions, to understand the nature of inclusive policies that have been followed, and also there have been qualitative interviews and focus group discussions. One striking observation that helps us think about the experience of queer people in science is this particular observation. Of the 60 institutions out of 120 that were approached, that responded to the query on how many transgender persons applied to their institutions, only 10 institutions reported having transgender applicants, which indicates how unsafe they feel when it comes to revealing their identity. Or feeling validated in these institutional spaces. So, I will end here by saying that studies on the questions of representation and inclusion tend to be largely focused by cis upper caste women. However, there are studies that are focusing on representation and experiences of people from diverse gender and caste locations that have emerged in the recent past, and there is a necessity to also do more such studies. I will end my talk here, and I also sort of wanted to touch on the knowledge question, but I think we can look at those, we can have more extensive discussions on the question of knowledge and the gendered nature of knowledge construction in the sciences, maybe through the feminist essays reading group. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you for a very interactive session. Thank you for responding.
Thanks a lot, Ashwati. So we'll open it up for questions, and as always, we let our student community ask first. Many of you have spoken, but yeah, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Or should we go to the faculty members first this time? No questions at all? You can also introduce yourself. So.
Yeah, also what your background is, I'd like to know. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Omkar. I'm a third year PhD student in Sitara. By training, I'm electrical engineer. And before joining PhD, I have worked in corporate as well as academics as a faculty member, very junior assistant professor. So I have seen many of these cases while doing the admission duties and all. That's why I was sharing my experiences rather when parents used to come and then we had to convince, don't mind to take admissions in mechanical, just don't follow computers and IT. So my question is, I'm seeing there are a lot of opportunities coming up for women scientists now in terms of scholarships, not only at a national level but at international level. So have you come across some studies being done? What's the impact of those opportunities now on the overall environment or researchers entering into the field of?
No, I haven't seen any such studies, but if anyone else is aware of studies that have looked at the impact of scholarships, please.
Yeah, anyone else?
Hi, myself Abhishek. Abhishek.
It's working.
Hi, yeah. Myself Abhishek. I'm a PhD fourth year student in Center for Policy Studies. My undergrad is in mechanical engineering, and then I have postgraduate degree modeling simulation under Applied Mathematics department, and now I'm working in intersection of AI and public policy. So my question to you is twofold. Actually, when you first of all, I would like to thank you for such a wonderful talk. You started with what is gender and what is patriarchy, but I felt like you skipped the question of what is science. Can we discuss gender, science and technology without discussing what is science? This is the first question. And second question is, what's so special about this science and technology? Because as these trends can be observed more or less in all fields. So I agree that there is some lead status we give to science and technology. But apart from that, what is so special about it?
Was everybody in the back able to hear the question? Yeah, okay. Sounds good.
So, yes, I think it's a good question. But the sort of what is science and technology, right? Like I agree that the sort of definitions that I have used in the talk when it comes to science and technology is in terms of how, in terms of the institutionalized and professionalized as they exist in university spaces. So I have looked at physics, chemistry, biology, engineering and technology in terms of how it is defined in the AISHE report, and then looked at the question of representation vis-a-vis that. The scope of the talk was not to talk about the definition of science and technology, but I would also like to know what exactly you were getting at when you mentioned what was your concern behind the question?
See, as part of research, I read philosophy of science, and so there is huge debate on what is science and what constitutes technology. So without getting into the details of that, can we discuss the gender nature of it? This is my primary concern.
Right.
Okay, if you are calling something is gender, but what it is itself, this question needs to be made first.
Absolutely.
And what's so special about it is these trends are observable all across the fields. Whenever you go to even any kind of job market, you will find these trends. Not necessarily science. After even graduating in, let's say, arts, the kind of turnover into jobs is more of same. So what is so special about science and technology? Why we need to be concerned about it? That's what is the motivation.
That's an interesting question. So historically, if you look at science and technology, and especially if you look at the question of representation, especially in the early 20th century, if you look at the representation of women in science, for instance, there were very few women who were able to access science and technology. There were a lot of, patriarchal biases and attitudes that prevented women from accessing these spaces. So, which is one of the reasons in heavily patriarchal spaces, and some of it also, the nature of the patriarchy, it's not that patriarchy has gone away, continues to exist. While the representation of women has improved in scientific and technological field, of course, you will be able to tell me more about how you experience patriarchy and sexism in science spaces. It hasn't gone away, it still exists. Which is the reason why there are social studies of science and there are feminist interventions that is looking at science. And there's a rich body of scholarship of women within science who are using feminist perspectives to study science. Right? So historically, especially over 20th century, in the early 20th century, for instance, it's very difficult for women to even access and do science. In fact, if you look at Annamani's biography, right, like Sunanda Bai, Lalita Chandrasekhar, in fact, Abasur's work, you will see that the kind of hardships that they had to endure to finish their thesis, they were not even granted PhD degrees. Right? So there is a history to this. While we are seeing that there is a parity in terms of representation now, we need to understand that that wasn't the case, and which is why there needs to be studies, and I think they need to continue because patriarchy and sexism hasn't gone away. Now, if you ask me what is special, at least from my location, I can say that as someone who was within the sciences and who experienced sexism and patriarchy in a specific way within the sciences, I do think it's very important to study these cases. And I think it's important to study patriarchy in all social spaces and social institutions. And science is one of them. So there's nothing extraordinarily special about science, but I think I have a specific interest because of my own specific location. And I think all of us need to be concerned about it as students of science and technology.
I just want to point out one interesting fact.
Yeah.
Some developing economies, there are certain kind of jobs which are becoming women exclusive. Like, for example, there are hard to find male nurses.
Yeah.
So there are hard to find male primary teachers. Most of the developing economies. I agree with you. It's important.
So there are specific, like you say, there are specific disciplines which are heavily gendered. Nursing is one of them. Teaching is one of them. Right? And even within the science disciplines, one thing that we noticed was, the heavily gendered nature of biological sciences. Right? It's been the case for a while now. So yes.
You introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Yashashri. I am a first year PhD student at Siddhartha IIT Bombay, Professor Pankaj, and I primarily interested in understanding how aspect, because I come from an environment science background and primarily working in forest governance, and women play a huge role over there in especially forest management and in rural India overall. So my interest would be to see that how they become part of formal supply chains when it comes to forest production. So my question, and also probably I would also take up a little bit of what you were trying to say, that because you also mentioned patriarchy, and that kind of also, and even in matriarchal systems or matrilineal systems, have a heavy impact on women as such, because recently I got to know about that in Meghalaya and most northeastern countries there are more maternal mortality rates, because women are, first of all, reproduction is seen as a blessing of God in their cultures, so they not only have to experience a constant pressure of childbirth, but they have to also participate in the workforce equally with men, and that's why, because of this drudgery, they are experiencing more maternal mortality. So my question was that, do you know of any kind of institutional initiatives which kind of at least tend to address this formally?
Institutional initiatives, I think in most science institutions, I can only think about ICASH is, at least I can speak for TIFR has a committee against sexual harassment. But I don't think any of these committees really, engage in gender sensitization or have extensive conversations on, say for instance, patriarchy, the nature of it, how it functions, the specific ways in which it discriminates men, women, or other gender minorities, right? So, institutional initiatives, I think, serve to sort of, I would say, perpetuate or maintain the status quo. Also because of the nature of leadership within institutions, it largely tend to be men, right? So there's a long way to go in terms of, in terms of how to address these questions. There are also, of course, in the context of science and technology institutions, you have specific programs that are aimed at ensuring that there is more representation of women and there isn't an attrition of women, especially after they reach the postgraduate level or even once they enter undergraduate level like Gati, and TIFA for instance has Vidya Vidushi. But institutional initiatives are limited. They work in very specific and very limited ways, I must say. But there is a necessity to even study these initiatives, and provide feedback on how they can impact. But I am not entirely sure whether one can completely dismantle patriarchy within. I hope so. But
in Western
Yeah.
Maharashtra, Praveen Mehtre from first year Sitara department, which is in Western Maharashtra and Marathwada, we will find that sugar cutting labor, especially a woman has to take out their embryo if they want to be either at the workforce. So will you please put some light on this, whether TISS has made such a study on this?
embryo.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know about this. Women have to.
Take out her.
They have to conduct their own deliveries.
Yeah. Means the then she only able to work at the workforce if she eats. Means take out the embryo, the
So
part.
you mean she's not allowed to sustain a pregnancy?
No. Yeah. Whether TISS has did some study on
I
this.
am not aware.
Because you are talking about the education
Yeah.
or higher representation of women in higher education.
Mm.
But at the workforce also, she has to lose her body part and she has to undergo the toilet.
Interesting.
Maybe.
Oh, hysterectomy. You mean
Sorry.
hysterectomy.
Sorry, uterus.
Yeah.
I am unaware of any studies of that kind. But this is quite shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes we not allow Sitara students to ask. There is a lot of non-Sitara students here, so please, you get a chance, Harry, don't worry. We'll come to you. Nobody from outside Sitara wants to ask. Sitting here for some reason.
Yeah.
No questions from anybody?
I am again the first year master's student at Sitara. I did my bachelor's in architecture. My question again is something that we see all the time when we try to talk about again cis women. When we try to talk about gender from again the general public. And it's also something I want you to throw light on is that there's a narrative that dismantling of patriarchy is again perpetuated by the minority, for example by women, again other genders as well, but not men. And it's always also understood that it's more beneficial to us, and that is why we talk about dismantling patriarchy again and again. I want you to sort of touch upon why is it important for society in general, how is it more beneficial to again the masculine side of the equation as well. Something a little bit more on this so I also get some pointers.
What are your thoughts on it? I think you have some thoughts on it.
It's always something that has stymied me when it's always pointed out that it's beneficial to you and that's why you're talking about it. So, if there's any thought.
Would someone else like to respond to this? Is the fight against patriarchy, is it only a concern for, should it be held by gender minorities and women alone?
Should I?
Yeah.
I necessarily don't think that it is a fight.
Yes. Okay, introduce yourself, please. So you don't want to introduce, that's okay.
No, I don't want to.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I necessarily don't think it's a fight that has to be taken by the gender minority. It is of course something which I wouldn't term as beneficial, but it's also beneficial to, I would say, male-bodied cis-het men, because they are also people who are oppressed under the patriarchal system. For instance, you have to be the breadwinner. I am doing my dissertation on incarcerated people, of which men are also a part. So most important concern for them is when they are jailed, they automatically the first reason they think is ki ghar kaun chalayega. So there is this unnecessary added burden of being the breadwinners, even if they might not have those masculine features of being, the prime, being aggressive, going out, earning. There might be people with, because the dichotomies exist in masculinity and femininity, I'm using those words.
But in any fight, be it in casteism, be it in patriarchy, be it in racism, I think the oppression is of the minority, the oppressed, but it is the burden of the oppressor to actually stop oppressing. Because unless and until the oppressor doesn't stop oppressing, how will the oppression even go away? So even if in science institutions, because I really like how you started with undergraduation, BA, PG, and then you were trying to draw a map of the entire trajectory. It's very interesting to see that how it's ultimately the men who end up concentrating powers. So science, technological institutions will not reform unless and until these men sitting at the top don't end up decentralizing. Because I noticed in one of your research you mentioned like how they transgress women's authority while hiring decisions and unethical practices are followed up. So I think it's a fight of everybody because the system in of itself ends up oppressing everybody in some way or the other.
That's on that point. I also wanted to invite more responses on how does patriarchy oppress men. I mean, I think one of the points that she brought up in her response is patriarchy is not something that is only, is not something that only operates on the quote-unquote oppressed gender minority groups, right? How does patriarchy subjugate men? Does it subjugate men? Or is it that there is an oppressor, and all men are oppressors and, they oppress women and other gender minorities? How does patriarchy operate? What are your thoughts on this? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vishal. I'm a first year student at HVCSE. I just wanted to, because somebody mentioned that from someone from here, that mechanical and civil engineering is not taken up because it's like a hazardous work environment. So just the idea that men are can be liable to these hazardous environment much more easily, but so certain risky jobs are only for men. That is one way of saying such risks should be only faced by men. So that is one way in which it manifests.
Hi, my name is Vishal. I'm also from Homeover Center. So I think dismantling patriarchy would have the effect of ending very harmful stereotypes. One thing is about this risky jobs. The point is that the job is risky. So why not think about how to make the job less risky instead of thinking of men as disposable, as कि कुछ हो जाएगा तो फिर कोई you don't have to care about men that much. And also, with respect to social circles that I have been in, it is just really sad to be around my male friends who are they don't know how to express their emotions. They need to get drunk, say something, and then it becomes like a big thing, कि आज मैं सब बोल दूंगा, that but when I am in a social circle which is much more mixed gender, or people from gender minorities, it's an everyday thing. We talk about emotions and expressions and feelings on a day-to-day basis. So I think for the benefit of men, dismantling patriarchy will take a lot of pressure from their heads. And it will just make men happier, I guess.
Many men who are falling over with laughter, thinking about themselves here.
I want to talk about their
You have asked this question to the senior men, those who have been married for a long time. I also want to point out about the sexual division of labor, which we have, something to be done by women and something to be done by men. And especially the social stigma where, let's say, the regular routine household work like cooking and let's say washing utensils not to be done by men especially, and if you do it, you have a certain stigma from your family members, from your relatives. That also where you see a kind of patriarchy affecting men.
Gender roles.
I'll just come to anyone else who's not spoken yet, please do feel free to say what you want to say and ask what you want to ask.
Alright.
Right.
So, to answer your question in terms of why, at least personally, I would like to answer that question, that why science and technology has the more pronounced or enhanced gender component, because if you see other streams of studies, there is, like she also mentioned through her statistics, that because biosciences or arts to a certain extent, or home science rather to a certain extent, these are these are rather extended versions of caregiving, and they directly go into caregiving, but science and technology has always been isolated from society as such. So the presence of women was never there in science and technology, because it's a man-made construct. Rather, biosciences is not, or natural sciences is not a man-made construct. It is rather just what we are trying to discover and understand. So if you go to a forest, women are already part of it. If you go to a farmland, women are already part of it. But if you go to an institution or rather a construction site, women won't be a part of it unless they have to kind of proxy as a labor or something of that sort. So that's why I feel that, and like he mentioned, that most of, like from personal experience throughout, after a certain point of time, the so-called popular boys club is there, that even in conferences, after a certain point of time, you don't engage in those conversations, because there are professors and men who have, after a couple of drinks, they might say something or do something. So to keep safe from there, you just go and, call it a day. So women don't engage, and those are the places where actual conversations happen between men, and actual decisions also happen. So, like, I don't know if you know about the Roman culture, but there used to be a bunch of men on a round table. They will, make a decision and then go get drunk and then come back and decide if they want to stick to that decision. So, these kinds of things have been prevalent so far, and women have never been part of that thing. So that's why I feel that this discussion is quite key.
It's not my response to it. I don't want to go into debate. Thing is, what I made, what is so special about science is because this is something, patterns are reflecting, like kitchen, then shopping for home, etc. are women's jobs. So perhaps biosciences are considered as something like kitchen, where it's kind of.
So there is a symbolic sort of an association with women and nature.
In home also, like repair jobs are mostly assigned to men. So men are more in mechanical engineering. It has nothing to do with science itself. My point is this: science and technology today is just reflection of our society. So what is so special about that? We need to investigate. What is the, again, coming back to the question, what is the special thing that should motivate us?
Anyone else?
The last one, it's something like that I want to add. Kitchen is the oldest and complex laboratory where the women had started doing all the experiments. Because what I found that in mechanical engineering we have the annealing process, that hardening and again cooling that materials to get more and more hardness to that. The same thing happens if we have potato or peanuts, if we put it in the hot and cold conditions. So what I feel that you are saying that science and technology, but what we live, what we do is nothing but the science, or the application of it's nothing but the technology. Thank you.
So there's a necessity to broaden the definition of science and technology. I completely agree. So if you look at something like midwifery, for instance, right? Like midwifery was something that was traditionally practiced by women. But when it becomes professionalized and institutionalized as gynecology and obstetrics, you see men getting into the field. Right, so there is a history. If you look at specific disciplines and how you also see that there is the gendering also has a specific kind of history. There was a shift at a particular point of time. So when that gets removed from the private space and gets moved into an institutionalized public space, it becomes a male domain. Right? Just like, for instance, if you look at something like but who does catering? You see a large number, when it becomes a professional economic activity, it's men who do it.
The big chefs.
Chefs, yes. So, there are specific ways in which the gendering operates and works. And the other point that I also wanted to make is, this entire dichotomy between theoretical sort of disciplines and empirical disciplines. Right? There too, there is a gendering. And of course, in India, for example, particularly in the context of mathematics, that's one thing I wanted to mention. You actually see that there is a significant number of women, doing mathematics in India. Whereas in the West, mathematics is considered to be a largely abstract, masculine sort of discipline. So there is also culture-specific differences in what is understood to be gender, right? And you see that very specifically for various systems. So it's not that it's universal, it's also culture-specific in what is understood to be gender. So, yeah.
All right. There are no more questions. Any last comments you want to say in addition to what you just said, and then we can wrap up?
No, I just wanted to say that this is primarily an introductory. I sort of started off not knowing where you were, so it's sort of, now I have a sense of where you are in terms of how you understand gender and how you are thinking about, and I also have a sense of your backgrounds. So I'm happy to have more conversations, and those of you who are interested in reading and reflecting further on, such questions, we are going to be starting a reading group. So please join in and have more conversations.
Yeah, you can write to me if you are interested. I can connect you to Aswati, or we have this little group in Sitara. Do feel free to reach out, and that will be fantastic if you get in touch with her. I think it will be extremely productive for all of us who are going to be part of that. So on that note, let me thank you very much, Aswati, for this really interesting talk. And we have a little token of our appreciation. I'm going to invite Ayadi for asking the most number of questions. Please come. Come. So this is a khadi scarf from Magan